This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. So welcome back to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles at a time when the world seems to be doubling down on its existing madness to make for ultra madness. And it's difficult to know exactly where to start. So I'm going to go to my place of origin, which is the United Kingdom, Britain, because events there have taken a very peculiar turn. As you will have realized, Boris Johnson left in disgrace, and the Conservative Party elected in his place Liz Truss, and in so doing seemed to make a transition from a party which was victim to the cult of personality to a party that was now victim to the cult of no personality whatsoever. I have to say that from the very beginning, her arguments hardly inspired confidence. They were based very much upon a rerun of sort of Thatcherite ideas about cutting taxes and getting rid of all forms of regulation and, putting money to where the money already was. So that was the politics of the thing. So she set about doing this and brought together a cabinet and selected a chancellor who was very much doing her will. And they came up with this program to absolutely transform as far as they could the country on down to what they said was going to be a growth path, which came from cutting taxes, very much from the rich, cutting taxes from the corporations, diminishing regulation, doing multiple things of that sort, but then recognizing that there was a chronic inflation problem in the country, that energy costs were soaring through the roof for a variety of reasons, not least was the war in Ukraine, and that they had to do something about mitigating the impact of these tremendous increases in energy costs, which were going to be at the basis of every household budget in the country. So they decided to cap energy costs, but in so doing, of course, they had to come up with the money to do so. So this was a very expansive program. The trouble was they didn't say how they were going to pay for it, and their argument, as has been made at various times, is that the tax cuts will really sort of simply be taken care of by themselves, because the tax cut will increase growth. The increased growth will give you increased revenues, so the tax cuts will pay for themselves. And that's always been a very hopeful argument, the evidence for which is very, very weak. In fact, the few times when experiments have been tried along those lines, as they were, I think, in the state of Kansas at one point, it turned out to be a disaster. So the tax cuts were, fundamentally part. In fact, in many ways, there was a certain similarity between the sort of economic program that Liz Truss set up and the budget that Donald Trump passed in 2017, which was a giveaway budget, a typical neoliberal giveaway budget to the mass of the population, all funded by increasing debt. And clearly the British government was going to be heavily indebted, but it didn't have the foreign exchange reserves. It didn't have the wherewithal to cover that debt. So the result of the launching of this program was a tremendous kind of problem internationally. The pound, the currency, crashed because nobody had much faith in it. Bond rates rose because clearly the British were going to have to issue a lot of debt, and the debt was going to be very costly debt because the interest rate was going to be very high. So this was a kind of financial disaster, and the more people looked at it, the more they said it was a total financial disaster. And after all these reassurances that somehow or other everything would be okay, they were going to stick to it, and so on, the markets basically acted in such a way that in order to save the British economy from totally crashing, they had to reverse all of the tax cuts. Now, this prompted, of course, then the whole kind of problem of, well, what does this do to Liz Truss as Prime Minister? She didn't even have the wit to deal with the situation. Margaret Thatcher, upon whom she plainly modelled herself, and in one sense has all of her worst characteristics and none of her good characteristics. Margaret Thatcher at least had the wit to turn these things around when she was faced with the idea that she should take a U-turn in her project. She famously replied, "U-turn? No, U-turn. This lady is not for turning." And it's a good way to put down one's opposition. Well, Liz Truss doesn't have the wit or the thought processes that allow her any kind of witty responses. So here we are with a prime minister who's completely lost all credibility, then having to appoint a new chancellor who reinstated the situation as it had existed before, rescinded all of the whole program, every single moment of it. They had started off by saying, "Well, we'll simply rescind the lower tax for the wealthy." Now they have to rescind the lower taxes for everybody and everything. They have to limit now the amount of time that they're going to cover energy costs and all the rest of it. So, in a sense, you see a situation where politically the markets of the world have actually dictated to the British Parliament and to the British political authorities that which was possible and that which they must do. So this raises the big question of what's the point of politics if the only point of politics is to do what the market tells you to do. And this raises also the question of how often is it that markets have this effect? What is this relationship between the economy and politics? And in what ways should we think about this unfolding into the future? Now, this is not the first time that we've seen this kind of phenomena occurring. And the sensitivity of governments to the will of the bond markets has always been an issue. And in recent times, it's become even more of an issue. Within the European Union, for example, there have been at least 2 or 3 occasions when national governments, which are supposed to be sovereign, democratically elected governments, gave way to technocrats who were essentially appointed as receivers by the European Union to manage the economy in a way which made sense in terms of what the bond markets were saying and the like. So this has been going on a bit throughout the European Union. It was going on also even in this country. There was this moment when Bill Clinton came to power, and he just appointed all of his senior cabinet ministers and apparently had a meeting with them and was outlining all the things he planned to do in his administration. And his newly appointed Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin from Goldman Sachs, was shaking his head. And Bill Clinton said, "Why are you shaking your head?" And Rubin basically said to him, "Look," he said, "the bond markets will not allow you to create that program." That program included things like universal health care, sort of serious redistributions of income through social programs and all the rest of it. And so Bill Clinton said, "Well, basically, you mean to say that my economic program and my prospects for re-election are almost entirely contingent on satisfying the wants and needs of a bunch of fucking bond traders?" And Robert Rubin basically said yes. So Clinton came in with this reform agenda very much in mind, but he ended up giving us the reform of welfare as we know it, the new justice laws and sentencing laws and criminal justice laws, gave us NAFTA, he gave us, in the end, the repeal of Glass-Steagall and the deregulation of the economy, and actually set up all of the institutions which led into the crisis of 2007, 2008. In other words, Bill Clinton was promising us one thing when he ran for president. When he got into being president, he did what the bondholders wanted him to do, what his Treasury Secretary from Goldman Sachs told him to do. And we have a period where Bill Clinton, coming in as a sort of progressive, ends up being one of the prime examples of a neoliberal proselytizer, in the sense that he's essentially consolidated the sort of neoliberal program that Reagan had initiated, and in much the same way that Tony Blair did the same thing in Britain, in a sense consolidating what Margaret Thatcher had done, although doing it from a somewhat left position. So the sensitivity of politics to what the bond market's going to say is in fact a long-standing kind of problem. In other words, the state in many ways relies upon somehow or other performing well enough in international markets and international competition to be able to find enough financial possibility to do creative things and to develop its own economy in its own way. But notice that what this whole system does is it challenges the idea that the state is sovereign. The state is not, under capitalism, sovereign. The state is actually contingent in terms of what it can or cannot do, in terms of what it actually encounters in terms of on bond markets and its debt. And after the reform, well, not reform, but the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, what the foreign exchange markets would do. In other words, you're likely to face, after 1971, a situation in which your currency would become worthless on the global stage if you didn't do what it was that the bond markets wanted you to do. So here is the situation which has been set up, particularly since 1971 and the liberation of the financial markets from the restraints of metallic currencies like gold and silver. Now, I think that this portends something for the future. I'm going to make the argument that this process of the disciplining of politics via financial markets, this disciplining has become stronger and stronger and stronger over time, to the point where, in a sense, I think we're moving into a world where democracy and sovereignty, which are a couple of the values that have pushed what you might call Western democracies, at least, to do the sorts of things they've done, that the sovereignty and democracy are in effect being eroded very much by the prominence of bond markets and bond market decisions in a sense, passing judgment upon political proposals. So if you come up with a bunch of political proposals which the bond markets don't like, then you're going to be in real trouble. Now, like I said, this idea has been around for some considerable time. I, for example, would trace it back to the mid-1970s, when Britain got into financial difficulties. Its foreign accounts was a mess. Its foreign exchange relations were a mess. And it started to appeal to the International Monetary Fund for help. And this was a time when the International Monetary Fund was still populated by Keynesians and wasn't going to be kind of ruthless and all the rest of it. But the IMF came in and basically said, look, your budget is completely out of whack. You're spending far too much on social services, like, everything from public health and education and, even down to sanitation and all the rest of it. You've got to have some very clear economies. And so the IMF prescribed a regime of austerity. This is, of course, become later standard practice for the IMF. So there's a a suggestion. The IMF tells Britain what kind of things it must do in order to qualify for IMF help in getting a bailout from its rather badly positioned financial structure. Now, there was a lot of argument within the British cabinet at this time over this. There was a kind of left social democrat, very influential, rather famous person, Tony Benn, who took the view that Britain should not go to the IMF. In fact, they should just try and make it on their own, and he objected strongly to the idea that sovereignty was going to be eroded in this way. And in effect, you're giving up your sovereignty by turning your fiscal policy over to judgment and coordination with the IMF. So Tony Benn was very much against it and took the position that both democracy and sovereignty were worth preserving, and to preserve them, they should basically tell the IMF, well, goodbye, no thanks, and let it go, and then try and fight their way out of the dilemmas that they had found themselves in. He in the end lost the argument, and of course he left the cabinet, and Callaghan actually went to the IMF and did all the things the IMF were asked for, and a lot of the austerity measures that were implemented in budgets in the 1970s, of course, led into a lot of fighting with Labour, big fighting with Labour. And big strikes going on, a winter of discontent in 1977-8, that kind of period. Very rough period of politics, because the implementation of IMF program was having a very hard effect upon the labouring population, and the austerity was having a very hard effect because austerity, in a sense, meant curbing the social wage, that is, the quality and quantity of social services which the population could expect. So what happened to Liz Truss was, in a sense, what happened to Britain in the 1970s, what happened to Clinton in the 1990s. But there's another example here which I think is very, very critical, and I want to talk about this one a little bit longer, because in this case, I think we have some acute lessons we might want to learn from what happens when a social democratic program gets really bolstered up and implemented. How then does capital respond, and what are the long-term effects? And the case I want to talk about here is that of France. Now, France had been governed effectively by right-wing and right-centre governments for 40 or 50 years in the period after World War II. And but there was always a strong Communist Party, and the Socialist Party became a very much stronger party during the 1960s and early 1970s. And in 1981, finally, the socialist candidate for president, Mitterrand, won the presidency. And he did so on the basis of a common program with the communists. So it was the socialists in alliance with the communists. And the socialists in alliance with the communists then not only captured the presidency, they also had a majority in the French Parliament. So Mitterrand implemented a very, very strong program based on Keynesian principles and based on social democratic thinking. Now, this is important. This is 1981. Remember, Thatcher, a neoliberal, had been elected in 1979. Reagan gets elected in 1980. So Mitterrand getting elected was completely opposed to this other trend, which is the big neoliberal push, which is coming out from Reagan and particularly from Thatcher. And here is Mitterrand, in effect, saying, well, we're not taking a neoliberal path at all. So what did Mitterrand do? First thing, he nationalized large chunks of the economy. All of the big financial institutions were nationalized. Now, to us, that'll sound kind of ridiculous. You nationalize all the banks. You have nationalized banks. That's crazy. Well, it's not crazy because the Chinese have worked with nationalized banks and have the party controls the banking system in China. And however you may think of it in any detail, you can't say that this is a monumental failure by any means. In fact, the nationalized big banking system in China seems to have worked extremely well. What has been a problem in China has been the shadow banking system, the sort of off-books banking systems that got set up. But the main banks have been pillars of stability in the economy. So, but anyway, Mitterrand nationalized the banks. He nationalized all the big insurance companies. So in a sense, the big chunk of the finance and insurance sector goes under state management. He also took over many of the companies. He took over IT. He took over the transport system. He took over telecommunications. Did all of those things. So in large segments of the French economy were nationalized. So and brought under public control. And the argument was that they needed to be rationalized, and the nationalization was going to allow that, and they all needed to be redirected to something which is it was an interesting phrase at the time, which was called the conquest of the domestic economy. France at that time was kind of in a situation where it was a lot of its consumption was actually based upon imports. Particularly imports from Germany. So that the question was, well, why is it that we're importing all of these commodities from there when we can make them here at home? In other words, it's a bit like the Latin Americans did in the 1960s. It was a sort of an import substitution idea. That the domestic economy, where people had needs for telephones and automobiles and equipment and ovens and all those kinds of things, that would then be supplied by French industry. So the idea was take over French industry, redirect French industry to satisfying demands, domestic demands. We then save on our economy. The euro was not yet then in existence. The franc will be strong, and we'll be able to ward off German and Italian competition and even British competition because our industry will meet the demands of the local economy. So that was it. And in addition to that, he did things like he increased the minimum wage. I forget by how much, but it was very substantial, maybe a 40 or 50% increase in the minimum wage. He reduced the work week from 40 hours a week to 39 hours a week. This was later, by the way, reduced to 36 hours a week. And a lot of expansion was put into education. A lot of expansion was put into healthcare. It was a really totally strong social democratic program. And one of the rules about this kind of thing is that if the economy is going well, then you can do some of these things, But if the economy is in a downturn, it's very, very difficult to do these things because as you want to do these things, you've got to find resources from somewhere else. In other words, the popular way to do it was to reduce the defense budget and shift those resources into social programs. Now you could do some of that, but even that became a sort of a bit difficult in time of an economic downturn. Now, as I mentioned, internationally in 1980, Reagan came to power. 1979, Thatcher had come to power. Both of them were talking about austerity. Both of them were thinking about neoliberal reforms. And at the same time, the whole problem of the US inflation was very, very high. The interest rates were very, very high, and something had to be done. And they came and had arisen in the United States what was called the Volcker shock, where Volcker raised the interest rate up to around, I don't know, forget now, 16 or 17% to counter a huge inflation rate. And the result of that was that there was a global recession. There was the Volcker recession or the Reagan recession. Unemployment in the United States went up to around 10%. This was felt throughout Europe. In Britain, there was also a similar kind of a set of events that took place, though not exactly in concordance with the United States. But there was France kind of on an expansionist mode, cheerfully incurring indebtedness. And here were these Britain and the United States facing recession and engaging in austerity. And the Germans were going along with the austerity mantra also, very strongly so, and so was Italy. So France found itself essentially isolated. Now, for 1 year, the French program went forward. And it was really done. I mean, they really did nationalize the banks. They really did nationalize a lot of the big companies. They really did try to reorganize things around the national, reorganize things around the meeting demand in the national economy and working things through that way. They really did try very hard. And I can tell you, the night that Mitterrand became president, there was dancing in the place of the Bastille all night long. There was an incredible kind of, because this was the first time in 50 years, they had a straight socialist communist party majority, and they were going to go and do these things. And there was euphoria in the country. And it continued for about a year. And then after about a year, the whole question came, how are you going to pay for it? Where is he going to pay for it? And the big capital in France started to actually desert the country. There started to be capital flight. And Mitterrand tried to control the flow of currency out of the country. In other words, if all the money left the country, then the economy would be in a real mess. So Mitterrand tried to stop it, and he made what some would consider a fatal mistake. When at a certain point he recognized that a lot of the money going out of the country was going out because people would take their credit cards and then spend their credit cards in Italy or Germany or Spain or whatever. And the French like their long vacations, and they certainly spend a lot of money on those long vacations. But Mitterrand tried to curb all of that by curbing the use of carte bleue, which is the Visa middle credit card when people left the country. Well, this immediately set the whole population against this program. But at the same time, people were trying to smuggle cash out of the country. There were fantastic stories about suitcases loaded down with French francs being smuggled into Switzerland and things of this kind. So the country started to get into a real mess after just about a year. By the end of 1982 and 83, Mitterrand is really up against the wall in terms of what can or cannot be done, in terms of capital flight, in terms of the failure of French industry to rack up its productivity to make it highly competitive with Germany and Italy and all the rest of it. So in the end, Mitterrand had to look at the situation and said, "Look, I either take the Ben path, which is what the communist people in his administration wanted to do, which is to effectively to challenge this whole thing and to go it alone." Mitterrand looked at the situation and said, "There's no way we're going to last if we go it alone. If we try to go it alone, I'm going to do a U-turn." So he was for turning, and the U-turn occurred, and France started to denationalize a lot of the companies that it had nationalized. The banks were nationalized for, 18 months or something like that, and then they got denationalized. A lot of the companies got denationalized as well. Some of the reforms, particularly around labor relations and minimum wage, stayed, and the length of the working week. Some of those did stay, but for the most part, the whole program was dead, and it was killed off by the fact that international markets were not going to tolerate that kind of program in a situation where everybody else was moving in the other direction towards austerity politics. And so Mitterrand, like later on Blair and like Clinton, turn to austerity politics, essentially deregulate, denationalize, create a entrepreneurial economy, and hope that somehow or other productivity in France would increase to the point where it would be competitive with other European-based industries. So the story of France and what happened with French is, I think, very, very critical. So here's the situation then, where in effect we see a way in which capital cannot function without controlling political movement, and it cannot function, and politics cannot function without the authority and without the support of the financial markets. Now, I've argued that this was kind of a very general sort of situation, and there's a long history of it. But I think what is significant to me is this, that what this entails is that the stronger this relation becomes between financial markets and politics, the stronger that relation becomes, the less we find a situation in which sovereignty is guaranteed and democracy is guaranteed. And what we have right now is a clear challenge to the perpetuation of the sovereignty of the state and also of the democracy of the state. And even in the United States, we have this whole thing about what's happened to democracy. Well, actually, democracy started to disappear a rather long time ago. That moment when Rubin told Clinton what he could or could not do, for example, was a moment when democracy goes out the window because, Clinton has been democratically elected to do X, and he comes in and he's forced to do Y. Mitterrand was democratically elected to do X, and he ends up having to do Y. So democracy is a bit of a farce, and everybody realizes that. So in the end, people start to realize that democracy is contingent very much on what it is that the financial markets will bear. Now, if we have this situation where democracy and financial markets are in opposition, where sovereignty and financial markets are in opposition, then you've got, if you like, the formation of the completion, if you like, of a process of formation of a purely capitalist state. And what I mean by this is the state has always been, of course, caught up with capital, and parcel of capital has always been essential to the workings of capital. But there comes a point where you may get what I think is increasingly a fusion of state and capital. And that fusion of state and capital is something that was being written about by Giovanni Arrighi some time ago and was written about by Fernand Braudel a long time ago when looking at the trajectory of capitalist development way back in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So here it seems to me we have to recognize that this coming together of state and capital, this fusion of state and capital, which is a kind of what I will call a metabolic fusion in the sense that they don't fuse. They are very separate from each other, but they are integral to each other. You cannot have the kind of state you now have without capital. You cannot have the kind of capitalism you now have without the state. And it's therefore a unitary dialectical relation between the two. And then you say to yourself, what form of governance is actually possible and is required for such a system in which sovereignty is being challenged by finance and which democracy is being challenged by finance? What kind of world is this run to, and what kind of politics does this give rise to? And here I think there's a very, very simple answer. The answer is that politics has to become non-democratic, or what you might call democratic authoritarian, which is very much what the United States is headed into, and what we see explicitly developed by Orban in Hungary, and why the United States right wing is so fascinated by Orban. You also see it in Poland. We now see it also in Italy. And we now see hopes for it continuing hopes for it in France, and we may well see it resurgent in Britain. So this kind of says to me that all of this stuff which is going on in the media right now, going, oh, what's happening to democracy? We've got to defend democracy. And you say, well, I'm sorry, democracy was gone rather long ago. It went away in all sorts of ways. It went away with Clinton and Rubin. It also went away, I would like to remind everybody, in the way in which Al Gore did not get elected. I mean, if Al Gore had done a Donald Trump and refused to concede that election, and there had been a thorough recount in all of Florida, what recounts showed, and these were thorough recounts later done by, I think, the Miami Herald and others, showed that if the recount had just been in those counties where there were all those hanging chads, then Bush would have won. But if the recount had been available to the whole of Florida, then Al Gore would have won. Now, this is very, very significant, okay? Because Al Gore would not, I think, have responded to 9/11 in the way that Bush did, because Bush was part of a neocon movement, and the neocons had always been wanting to get Saddam Hussein, and had basically said the only way we're going to get Saddam Hussein and have actually get, if you like, some public support for getting Saddam Hussein, that the only way we'll do that was to have something like a Pearl Harbor. And of course, 9/11 was the Pearl Harbor that allowed the right wing to do that. I think when the history of the world gets written, if it can be written in maybe 50, 60 years' time, that election that went to Bush, not democratically, but by the Supreme Court, 9 people on the Supreme Court deciding to give it to Bush, and they gave it to Bush, and Al Gore conceded. If that election had gone the other way, the invasion of Iraq would not have occurred, and Middle Eastern politics and many of the things that have flowed since would have not have occurred. Now, I know this is counterfactual argument I'm making, but I think this is terribly, terribly important to make. So that here we have a situation in which increasingly politics, and as we just seen in Britain and we saw in France and we're seeing throughout Europe and we've been seeing in this country as well, the politics in general is subservient to financial interests and is under the thumb of financial interests, while financial interests are engaging in practices which have to be bailed out by the state. So it's not as if financial interests simply govern the state. The state governs financial interests. That's what I mean by saying it's a kind of a metabolic relation which exists between state and capital. And that metabolic relation between state and capital is not open to democracy in any real meaning of the term. And it's not even open to sovereignty in the classical sense laid down in the Westphalian agreements. In other words, we're moving into a different world in which this fusion of state and capital is becoming closer and closer. And to the degree that it is becoming closer, we actually see it's already there and was from the very get-go there, of course, in the case of China. So what we see is a world which is headed in a particular direction. And I think that direction is very troubling. And it also then poses the question of what kind of socialist response can there be to this? And particularly, I think it's interesting to say to everybody, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and all the rest of it, look carefully at what happened to France in 1981 before you try to step too far down that path, because you're going to find something very, very similar. And therefore, we have to deal and confront this fusion, if you want to call it that, but I'll call it a metabolic relation between finance and the state, which is not a very easy thing to do. So we'll have more to say about that in later sessions. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production.